Hi everybody, it's good to see you. If someone can very kindly type in chat once the streaming is getting to you and you can see me and hear me. I'm just waiting for the lag to finish so that it actually starts with you. Fabulous. Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, Jaden. Okay, well, here we are. Happy Thursday. Here we are online again. It's great to see everybody coming into the chat, and I can see you as viewers online, which is kind of exciting for me. So I've been working hard to figure out, the rest of term and the lectures to make sure that you get what you need, but don't have to do too much work. So I wanted to let you know I have put a slide with just a couple of important announcements at the front, and hopefully you have a chance to look at those and make sure if you have any questions that you can ask me in the chat or you can email me. Of course, for all of us, the final exam is top of mind right now, and the university is trying to organize that we all have our final exams when we said we would have them. So I have my application in. They make you do a form, and I've put my application in for the final exam on the day and time when we said we would have it. And I am waiting to hear back for confirmation from the central administration that that's what they're doing. The minute, I promise, that I hear confirmation and I have the details of how it will be done, I promise you I will send you a note on CourseSpaces and tell you in class, assuming that they tell me by the end of next week, which they promised me they will. At the moment, the TAs and I are still planning to deliver the final exam just as if it were an assignment, just like the ones you've been doing. That would be posted, and then you would complete it, fill it in, and return it to us using CourseSpaces. So that's where we're at right now. And I promise you I'll give you an update if as soon as I hear anything. Okay? The second thing is that usually during this week we have a Lab 11 coming up for next week, and that is usually on top of the work that we would do to prepare for class, for lecture. But what I decided to do was to make your exam, sorry, I'm trying to read Ellie's question at the same time. You don't have to print it, Ellie. You can just type into it and then save the file and send it back. So you don't need a printer. Yeah, not everybody has a printer, so that's okay. So in terms of the lab, as I said, normally you would be doing an additional Lab 11 in addition to the preparation you'd be doing for class. But what I've decided to do is actually just use Lab 11 to help you prepare for class and also to help you review and study for the final exam. So I have completely rewritten Lab 11 to just be work that supports what we're doing in lecture and also prepares you and gives you a really good head start on the final exam. So that's what Lab 11 does, and I've said it really clearly on the CourseSpaces site, but I'm going to say it here as well. You do not have to submit it. There is no submit button because you do not have to submit it. Lab 11 is to be done, it's self-directed, it's to be done to support what you're going to bring to lecture next week in terms of your ideas and your conversation on chat. And the work that you do for Lab 11 is going to be tested. There will be questions on it in the final, on the final exam. So that's how we will assess Lab 11, and you'll still get a grade for Lab 11, but it will be assessed on the final. So just so you know, and I've tried to save you as much time as possible, and I've cut out quite a bit of the work so that in fact Lab 11 is just you working on your coursework and getting ready for the final using some activities that I've structured that I really, really hope will help you. I have a kind of a template that I've made for writing an essay, for example, and I promise that if you just answer those questions in order that I've made for you on the lab, and do the work and the research that I laid out there, if you just go through that, you'll actually have an essay that almost writes itself, I promise. You probably don't believe me. And if I was saying this in class, you'd probably be laughing at me. But give it a try and see if it helps you. I really hope it'll help with that exam. And I also hope that it will help with any essays or essay exams that you have in the future. Jessica's asking if there will be content from other labs included in the final. Yes, the final is comprehensive, and I can ask you questions about anything that we've done in the course on the final exam. Like I said last time, the details of past labs up until the midterm, just like everything else, were tested before on the midterm, but any labs that you've had since the midterm could be tested on the final as well. Or at least you could use your experiences in those labs to answer questions. Okay, hope that helps, Jessica, and hope that helps Ellie. The other thing is that you know that you have newspaper 3, your newspaper 3 assignment due, which would have been due in lab next week. And I have put up a button for you to submit newspaper 3. Just like you have with your other, like your lab debates and so on. And what your TAs have asked me to really emphasize is please, please, please make sure you have the URL, a really accurate URL for your assignment, for your newspaper article, for the assignment on what you hand in. Because as you can maybe imagine, your TAs are going to have to go check each and every one when they're grading your newspaper. And you will make their lives so much easier, and they will be so grateful if you please include an accurate URL. Now, I know some people have not yet submitted their debates and they're late. The TAs have told me that. But I'm guessing that if you're here and you're in class, you're probably up to date. And the majority of people have done it. So that's awesome. And well done for keeping up. Okay. So the first thing that I wanted to do today was to go back to the activity that we were working on. Do you remember we were summarizing, looking at how you could predict a country's place in the world system, depending on where their particular percentages were in different parts of the economy. And I can see that I have just made this too small. I'm not sure why that happened, but I will fix it. Okay. All right, that's better. So you remember that we looked at that. Is anybody able to type in the percentages that they filled out for their homework in the table? Can you type into chat the percentages you found for the different So as I had asked you to go and try and fill out the different percentages for Canada, China, and India, and see. And what you do is you take those percentages from the graphs that I gave you and use the last year's information that you have available. It's not always super up to date what is provided by the UN, but how did you do? Okay, well done, Ellie. So Ellie has 78%, 18.3, and 3.7. Well done. That's exactly it. That's what I got. How about China and India? Can someone else help Ellie out and look for the last numbers on the bar graph for China and for India? Yes, well done. Okay, so China, Jessica has now 31.4, 31.1, and 38.5. Okay, well done. And Ellie's saying that for India we've got 26.5, 22.4, and 51.1. Now, you have to be a little bit careful because the bar graphs for India, just watch out, the bar graph for India is upside down in the sense that the colors are the opposite from the ones for Canada. So you have the numbers perfectly. I just want to check when we look at this to make sure that you have them in the right columns. So I'll show you here what I got. And then you can see that enables you to predict. Then you can see it predicts the place that you have in the world system, in Wallerstein's world system. So well done. You pulled out exactly the right information, and you can see that where you have a country like Canada, where you've got this really high percentage in the tertiary sector in services, then you have a core country. And you can see India is the opposite of that, where you've got over 50% in this case in agriculture, 22% in production, so manufacturing of some kind, and 26.5% in the tertiary or service sector. Now, I find India's really interesting case study to look at because what I've been noticing over the years is that actually India has kind of jumped. It's interesting. India has jumped from primary to tertiary. And if I was in class, I would ask you about that. So maybe you can think, why do you think that India has jumped from agriculture or primary production to tertiary? What I'm really asking is, what is India well known for in services right now? Can you think? What do you know about India in terms of the kind of service sector that they have? What do you think of when you think of services that you would be using that are coming from India right now? Let's see if you can think about that a little bit. Okay, well done. So yes, Claire, you're 100% right. Call centers. So if you call up your bank at 3 in the morning to help you with a problem you're having, very often the call center is in India. And you get this incredibly helpful person who speaks beautiful, clear English, who is halfway around the world and seems to know exactly what's going on in your bank just down the street. It's amazing, completely amazing. Anyway, you might think about, why is it that India has taken up this role? Think about history. Why are call centers in India? For e.g. for banks. Why do you think that is? If you think about history and what we've talked about in terms of colonialism. Colonialism is the big tip there. Oh, you guys are good. You guys are really good. Yes. So, colonialism is always a great tip to think about. Anytime I ask you to explain anything, that's a joke amongst many of my students, is that colonialism's often the answer to a question on the final if you don't know what the answer is. That's a joke. Okay. So, yes, because India was colonized for the British, for better or worse, the language that was imposed on the country was English. And so the English spoken in India is very clear, very high quality. And so if you combine that, as Claire is saying, with the low wages, what you have are people who are very, very well equipped to person call centers and to help with banking and so on. It also helps that they are available at times when service centers aren't actually open, for example, in Canada. But as I say, you can call India at 3 a.m. and they'll be more than happy to help you. So, so what I think, I mean, I'm not a super expert on this, but that's my reading of why India has jumped quite quickly into a larger service sector rather than going through the traditional model that we've talked about. And I think that's my theory as to why that's happened. And it's a very, very interesting case study. China's also really interesting, to go back to the semi-periphery there, in that, as I said last time, it's moving very quickly. It's got a balance there in the table in the data that I showed you, but China very quickly moving towards urbanization and moving towards services and manufacturing in equal measure, and just growing very, very quickly. Of course, things are changing, temporarily right now, and things are very much in flux. But this is the kind of longer term view of things, I think. So I find that kind of interesting. And what it means is that, as a tip on the final, I might give you some numbers, some data, and ask you to predict where you think a country is in Wallerstein's world system, what that might tell you about, for example, what its population pyramid might look like, or what the issues might be in that country. And I want to emphasize that on an exam, I will give you a very clear example. It won't be a borderline case. So you can see that if agriculture is 50% or more, that's going to be a periphery country in the model. If you're looking at a core country, you're likely looking at 75% or more services in that economy. Semi-periphery examples are harder to find. China is a great one, but it will change pretty quickly, I think. But there you would be looking at a balance across sectors rather than necessarily seeing a particularly large sector of any of the three. So I hope that helps. Okay, so well done for those of you who filled in those numbers and you did those predictions. That's a great way of summarizing our knowledge from last time. And what I'd like to do now is move on to something that I find fascinating, and it's also a really good area to get a job in if you're good at it. So some of you have written to me and said that you are doing a joint major or combined majors, or you have interests in both geography and economics, and well done for being so patient to get to this section of the course, if that's true. But it is a great combo as a degree, and if you are good at doing these kinds of things, and if you're good at economics, then I really super recommend thinking about a career in this kind of area. So people who are good at economics and geography often find location theory really interesting. Why is it that we locate the economic activities of a country, of an economy, where we do? How do we figure out where industrial plants go, or where services go, or where the best pool of labor is going to be for our particular industry? So it's super interesting if you're into education, into economics, to look at these things. So that's what I'd like to talk about now. And economic geography has tons and tons of models, as you can imagine, for predicting the location of different types of industry. So what I like to do in this course is just give you a little bit of a taste of this. I do teach a course in economic and political geography at the second year level that goes into this in a lot more detail, but this is just to give you a little bit of a taste. So what I did was I picked one model from each of the different sectors. So we've got primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors, and I thought, well, I'll just pick models from each so you have an example. So the first thing that we should do is take a look at some of just the principles of location theory. How do we sort of think about what might be the reason that certain things locate where they do? And this is where certain key elements of economic theory really come into play. So we're going to talk about wages, we're going to talk about transport costs, and the types of things that impact transport costs. And we're also going to talk about where the skilled labor is and why that's important. So you can see on this slide that there's just some very useful generalizations that we can make. So primary economic activities, and remember those were things like agriculture, logging, forestry, mining, these kinds of things, are usually found near the source of whatever it is that you're extracting. Now, why do you think that is? Why are primary activities located close to where we are extracting them from? And that's kind of a generalization, because obviously if we're doing agriculture, we're extracting them essentially from the ground, from the earth. If we're mining, we're also extracting in that sense, forests and so on. But that's the kind of idea. So why do you think, if we're doing mining, that we're going to locate our primary activity at the site of the resource itself? Why are we going to do that? Yes, so that's fabulous. So obviously, Alpha Plant Mom, I think that's Dylan. Jaden, Peter, Victoria, you're all thinking about really important economic concepts. So I'm guessing that you've taken economics, and this is probably not new to you, but with my apologies because it's new to others in the course. But yes, we're talking about transport costs, and in this case, we're talking about transport costs both because the raw materials that we would be transporting are very heavy, but also because if you think about it, there's a lot of waste involved. By which I mean, if you cut down a tree, you don't want to use all of it usually. You strip off the bark and the leaves and the twigs and so on, and the piece of the tree that you're going to use is very small. Mining for diamonds is the most extreme example of this, if you think about it. So I am not a diamond expert, but in order to get one diamond out of the earth, you have to move tons of rock and soil and so on. And so it would be really silly to move all that soil and rock somewhere else and then unpack it to find the diamond. So what you're going to do is to essentially reduce the raw material down to what it is you want to use before you transport it out. And of course, with diamonds, you can further cut them and so on, but the additional wastage of doing that is very, very small. So that's why the costs would be prohibitive. And so with primary extraction of any kind, you're getting rid of the waste, or what is considered waste. I'm not saying that it is, but is considered waste to that industry before you do anything with the product that you have. And that makes it easier to transport and way lighter. Diamonds is the example that I would put in my notes here because it really helps you to understand it because it's such an extreme example. So I hope that helps. In terms of secondary industry, manufacturing, you have a more complex relationship there. You have a certain amount of raw materials that you need. You often also have water that you need to process whatever it is that you're processing. And you may or may not need certain types of labor, and it depends partly on whether you need skilled labor or not for your processing. But when it comes to manufacturing industry, you have a more complex decision tree as to where to put things, and it's usually a kind of a best case scenario between minimizing the transportation costs of your raw materials, but also being near the labor that you need, and also being near a way of transporting your produced goods out once they are produced. So it's a more complex decision tree, and we'll get to that in a minute. And then tertiary service activities are interesting. If you think about things like higher education, for example, or high-tech industries, what do you think is the main factor in high-tech location? What do you think is the main factor in the location of high-tech industry? Think about who works there, and think about the places you know that are high-tech. So a tip, if you haven't thought about this before, is Silicon Valley in California, which of course is one of the very famous places that high tech has come. Yes, so well done, Peter. Yes, it tends to be dictated by where the skilled workers are, and it's different from secondary production in this sense, in that it's not just where the skilled labourers are, but it's actually where they want to be. That's the really interesting thing. So you're right, Dylan, that's exactly right. And it's often where highly educated people who can command, as they say, the market, wish to live. So if you're, what they say is that in a high-tech industry, your most important asset is your creativity, your human brain capacity, your ability to think creatively, to have a workforce that's highly educated, highly skilled, and so on. And in order to do that, you have to tend to go where they want to be. And you attract the very best thinkers by giving them the environment that they want to live in. So that completely explains Silicon Valley. In addition to the fact that Silicon Valley is located near what? So it's not just people love the environment in California, for sure, but what else is in California that they need to draw on? And the tip is you're connected to one right now, or you're part of one right now. What do we have a big concentration of in California? Oh, the ocean. Yes, that's true. People love the environment in California, and the ocean, for sure. It's a huge draw. But I'm thinking of something else. Think about infrastructure. Yes, Jaden got it. Universities. So in Southern California, you've got the whole of the UC system. Really great universities. UCLA is there. UC Berkeley is there. Stanford is there. Stanford, very well known. You've got links across the country from those universities, very well connected, across to Harvard and MIT and so on. So you have very locally a group of people who are highly skilled, highly educated, who love the environment, and really want to stay there and live there. And so that was a really natural place for Silicon Valley to set up. So great ideas. And you're right, Claire, that because that you have a highly educated group of people there, they're interested in the environment. So yes, they start to look at things like solar and wind power, and how they can use those in keeping their industry clean. So you're not wrong at all. That's a really important aspect to it. So they will look for places where government regulation allows them to support the kind of lifestyle that they'd like to have, including, in the Silicon Valley case, environmental improvements like wind power and so on. So you're 100% correct. That's true as well. So yeah. So those are some of our principles. And once you start to think this way and you start to understand this, it gets way easier. So I want to take one model from each sector and show you how geographers have worked to think about location theory. And you know, the funny thing is, this first one is really, really, really old, and yet the principles, the understanding behind it, still work quite often to this day, which is kind of interesting. So this first model that geographers developed, and to me it's actually the first famous economic geography location theory that we have. And this was developed by von Thunen in the 1880s, 1842, in Germany. And he was trying to figure out what the most efficient way of planting crops would be, or different types of farming would be, around his small holding or around a village. And he uses some very straightforward principles to do that. You need to put your mind back a little bit to the 1840s. So in terms of the transportation of food, the most important thing is, what did we not have when we transported food in the 1880s? If that makes any sense. What do we not have available to us? Think about when we transport food now, what we use. Yeah, well done. Refrigerate. So we didn't have trucks, obviously, but most importantly, we didn't have refrigeration. Well done. Yes. So we have to think about that in terms of really important is perishability, which I can't spell and talk about at the same time. Perishability of food is key. Yeah, well done. So perishability of food is key because we don't have refrigeration. So if we have, what von Thunen said was, and this is really hard because in class I would draw diagrams of this on the board, and I and I would ask you not to look at the diagram first, because if you work it out for yourself on your own, you'll always remember it. Whereas if you just try to learn it, it doesn't make any sense. So try not to look at the diagram for a minute. Say we had, let's say we had tomatoes. We had grain, dairy cows, if we have all of these things, which would you farm closest to your house and why? So that's basically the question he was trying to ask himself. He has all these different crops and animals and things that he wants to farm and produce, and which of them come closest to the farmhouse or to the village, and why? What order? what's closest to your house. Yeah, you're right. You're right, Bridget. I can. I'm not very good at it, and I don't know how to do it. So forgive me, please. I'll try to do better. If I'm teaching online in future, I promise I will learn all these things. Okay. Okay, got some really good ideas here. If you're able to look in the chat, you can see people's ideas. So you're thinking exactly right. You're thinking exactly right. Here's how to think about this. If you do the logic of it, you'll never get tripped up, okay? So, the dairy cows. Let's think about dairy cows first, okay? How often do you need how often, you're exactly right, you've all got this right. How often do you need to tend to a dairy cow? And Ryan is saying daily. Yes, in fact, often. I always ask in class this question. How many of you have actually milked a cow? Because sadly, I tend to find not many people have. We're all so urban now, we often don't know how to, even how to do these things that probably our great-grandparents did. Jaden says, milks a cow every day, but I don't think that's true, Jaden. Although maybe it is if you're on a farm, I don't know. But you may have just been answering the previous question. Anyway, I hope you do, because it's very satisfying if you know how to do it right. Really, that's awesome. Okay, so I wish you could talk, because you could tell us about this. But in my humble experience, I had one of my best friends at high school had a dairy farm in the UK, and they milked their cows twice a day. So, yes, dairy cows need to be milked. And in fact, because they're bred to produce a lot of milk, they get super uncomfortable if you don't milk them, and quite irritable. So, you need to milk them often. In addition to that, as you're quite rightly saying, if you don't have refrigeration, as you didn't in this time, you've got to be close to market, because you've got to take your milk to the village. Every time the milk is produced, you've got to take it to the village and sell it to get it to your consumers so they can drink it before it goes bad. One of the things that amazed me when I came to Canada was how long the milk lasts. In the UK, when I left, they were still delivering milk to the door in bottles, and it would last maybe 2 days, even in the refrigerator. So I guess we must pasteurize the heck out of things here, I guess. And milk here will last 2 weeks or more. It's amazing. But milk didn't used to do that. So you become aware of that very quickly if you've ever had to drink sour milk. Anyway, so yes, dairy cows is a great example of how to think about von Thunen, because you've got both the fact of how often, so you want to ask yourself these two questions. How often do I need to tend to something? And how perishable is what I've produced? In other words, how close do I need to be to the market to be able to sell it before it goes bad? So you want your dairy cows close to you. But, on the other hand, they can be, and I love dairy cows and horses, but they can be a little bit smelly. In other words, you don't want them right outside your window. So, so let's think about tomatoes. Let's think about tomatoes. how often do you tend tomatoes or flowers? That's something else that was grown a lot in Germany at that time. And how perishable are they? So just apply exactly the same idea. So why do you tend to tomatoes? Well, remember, you don't have really pesticides in those days, so you're have to go and pick the bugs off them. You're going to have to make sure the birds don't eat them. You're going to have to do a lot of things like that, and you're going to have to weed them frequently. Flowers you're going to have to cut as soon as they're ready. So quite often, and you're going to want to take them to the market before they go bad. Tomatoes also quite perishable. If you cut them, you cut them, they squidge. If you don't, I mean, the tomatoes we get that are flown in come in rock hard, and then they fake ripen them with sulfur and stuff. But if you live on a farm and you pick a tomato, you want to pick it when it's exactly, ready, almost ready to eat, and it's delicious. And did I say you milk tomatoes? I thought I said you tend tomatoes. I'm so sorry. So how often do you tend them and weed them and all of those things? That's what I meant to say. So yes, you're going to weed them. You're going, but then they're quite perishable once you've cut them. Same with flowers. You can't squidge them or anything like that. So basically, you're probably going to have the tomatoes and the flowers right next to your house within that zone. Same zone as dairy, because the principles are the same for dairy, but the dairy is going to be slightly outside the tomatoes and the flowers, just because it's a bit smelly and for health reasons. So there's your first layer. Okay, now let's think about ranching. So still cows, but in this case steer, and you're ranching them. So how often do you tend beef steer? How any of you own a cattle ranch in Alberta, or have farmed or helped on a cattle ranch in Alberta? Usually the young steer are put out to pasture, and you kind of put them out there and they feed and run around, and then you collect them in usually the following year and take them to market. I mean, obviously you go and check on them and so on, but that's about it, at least historically. Now we might be, doing other things, veterinary and so on, but in those days they basically put them out to pasture, literally, and then they just went and got them. Same with sheep. So for that reason, and of course, and I don't mean to offend people who are vegan and vegetarian, because this is a very difficult subject for them, but when you are taking the steer to market, in this case, they are on the hoof. In other words, you drive them, and so in that condition, in that sense, they're not. It's not a perishable product. So, where are you going to have your cattle ranch? And Ryan's playing with me, which isn't fair, because I can't talk, teach, think, and listen, and type, and then figure out you're playing with me at the same time. That's not fair. Okay. So where are you going to have your cattle ranch in this model then? Where's the ranching going to be for beef? not for dairy. It's quite different. And then what about grain? Grain has to be weeded and protected. And yep. So you're saying ranching, yes, so you're 100% right. So the ranching is the other extreme. The ranching is completely the external outer ring of his model. And then so then you have to think about the where grain is going to go. Grain, you do have to weed it. You have to put, nowadays you put pesticides on it. You weed it. You have to harvest it, but you also have to keep the birds off it, and you have to think about rodents and so on. And then once it is harvested, although as long as it's dry, it's fairly easy to transport, it can't really get wet. So you want to get it into the barn pretty quickly to protect it from getting wet, otherwise it gets moldy. So where's the grain going to go in this model? It's basically going to go in between those two things. So we've set up our model where we've got what's called market gardening, and I just want to emphasize that is basically your tomatoes, flowers, etc. And dairy is first. Then you're going to have your grain, and then you're going to have at the edge your ranching. So you've totally got it. Now I want you to take a look at the model on the and look at the diagram that I've given you. It's figure 9.19 in your textbook, and you'll see that we've produced, through our logic, we have produced exactly what von Thunen came up with. So we are at least as smart as von Thunen in 1842, which is kind of nice. But take a look closely at the rings around this center that he predicted, and there's one thing there that stands out as being a bit surprising. Tip, it's green. What's the one that stands out as maybe a bit surprising? One ring that doesn't necessarily make sense to us in his model. Yeah, exactly, Jaden. The forest doesn't make sense. So, you know what I'm going to ask you. Why do you think that von Thunen had the forest so close to village/farm in his model? Why would we need it to be there? Yes, well done. It is cultivated forest, so why? Why do we need it to be there? So close. Oh, that's a good suggestion. Protection, yeah. But you know, it could be protection from wind, but that's a good side effect for sure. But why else? Think about what you need in 1840 Germany. Yeah, you got it. Okay. Yeah. So firewood we need all the time. We've got to collect it. It's heavy. And we need kindling. So we've got to, if we're going to heat water, if we're going to cook food, if we're going to keep ourselves warm, all of those things, and we're going to need that on a regular basis. So we are going to have to go out and collect firewood all the time. So that is why nowadays, so if we were doing von Thunen today, if I asked you in the exam, do his principles work today? They do work in some ways today, to this very day, but the thing that's changed, two things have changed. Refrigeration now exists, and secondly, the main source of energy that we use for heating, for cooking, and so on, would be, you know, gas or electricity coming to the house. We don't generally go out to collect firewood, although for sure people still do, of course. In which case, they're going to want some cultivated forest near them. Tiana's saying, what's the difference between cultivated forest and true wilderness? Well, wilderness was there first, and a cultivated forest is where you either protect a patch of forest or wood because you need it near your house, or you plant it. And then once you've got the area of forest there, you manage it very carefully. So you do pollarding to create thinner sticks for firewood. You grow particular species which are good for firewood. They might grow fast and produce a lot of firewood quickly. So it's managed, in other words, it's not just, quote, natural in that sense. So I hope that answers that question. So for the purposes of the exam, and certainly at first year, you don't need to know this equation that's on this sheet. I'm just showing it to you to show you that you can model location theory, and you can still do a pretty good job with von Thunen modeling agricultural production. And certainly people do use sophisticated mathematical modeling to do this. So I just wanted to show you that that's possible. And the two things that we talked about, refrigeration and changes in heat and energy and so on, are the things that will have changed the von Thunen model nowadays. But still, when we think about perishability and so on, it's still relevant. And still, when you think about where things are grown on the island in relation to Victoria, it's still relevant. So I just find it really cool that it still works. Okay, so hopefully now you understand that, we can think a little bit about same kinds of principles that we talked about, but how these might apply to locating secondary industry or manufacturing industry. And here again, there are complex and sophisticated mathematical models that can be used. But one of the most famous geography ones is Alfred Weber's model from 1909, still used a lot today in some form. And I've put the diagram here, not again because I'm going to expect you to calculate any mathematical equations in Intro Human Geography, but because it gives you the idea that he's using a kind of gravity model, the kind of thing you would use in physics, where essentially if you imagine that you have balls of different weights and string holding them together, that there would be a kind of a center of gravity in the middle where your various factors kind of maximize your efficiencies. So Weber talked about only three, and of course you can probably think of many others, but he talked about just three factors that he felt were the most important in determining where we locate an industry, such as steel making. So he talked about labor costs. You want to minimize your labor costs. You want to minimize your transportation costs. And the third thing is you want to maximize your benefits of agglomeration. Now, what do we mean by agglomeration? Agglomeration is when a particular industry locates close together. So, for example, it seems odd sometimes that you would have companies that compete with each other locate close together. But the reason they do that is because they can benefit from scale economies. Sometimes they can purchase raw materials together, and it gives them extra purchasing power. But also, they often can share a pool of skilled labor. So, for example, in Hamilton, Ontario, which used to be called Steel City, you had people who were highly skilled in mixing alloys that were used in very high quality steel making. And those employees could be hired by all of the companies who used to have steel production around that area. So you're minimizing labor costs, you're minimizing transport costs, and you're maximizing any benefits that you have of agglomeration. So when you have to look at each one of these and think about the respective weights of each of these in determining where you're going to locate your industry. And you've got to think both about how you would, how you produce it. So you're going to think about the cost of transporting your raw materials in. So for example, what are the raw materials that you need to make steel? You need iron, and you need coal, and you need water, and various other things that go into it. So you're going to want, all other things being equal, you want to be pretty close to those resources because they're heavy to transport. But you also need to be fairly close to a pool of skilled labor, and you want that labor to be relatively inexpensive. And then you want to be in a place where they're used to producing steel and have the skills, the technology, the infrastructure, and so on to support its production. And that would give you a triangle for production and where the best place would be to do that. But then you also have to think about how you're going to transport what you've produced. And so usually, again, when you're talking about steel, you're talking about historically either large waterways or railways to transport the steel out. So if you go back to thinking about the core industrial areas in North America and the northeastern seaboard, you'll remember I talked about the fact that coal and iron ore were present, but that we also had large amounts of easily accessible water, both for production, the steel production causes a lot of heat, and also for transportation out. And so once you see that, if you think about that triangle, you can see that the area around the Great Lakes, because of the resources that were there, but also the water availability and the skilled labor that grew up around that area, you can see that that then becomes the perfect location for the location of the steel industry. Now, what's happened? So that makes logical sense. And then the question is, so what has happened since then that means that the steel location triangle has changed? Where has steel gone and why? Where is it produced now? What happened? So Weber's principles still hold true, but the triangle has got dramatically distorted when it comes to something like steel production. And why is that? Which of those costs has changed dramatically that helps us to understand what has occurred? Yes, you're both right. So the driving force is that labor has become dramatically cheaper overseas at the same time as transportation costs have gone down. So you're 100% right. There are two key factors there, and both are correct. So labor wages have become much cheaper. That means that labor has in the triangle is a much weaker pull. It has a lot less force in the triangle now because it's cheaper elsewhere. Whereas transportation costs have decreased dramatically also, which means again that the cost of transporting both your raw materials and the finished goods has gone down. So that means you can move overseas. For a while, Hamilton was able to survive, and that was because Hamilton had the high quality skilled labor, the highly educated people who knew how to mix the steel alloys. But once those people were encouraged overseas as well, or once that could be done using technology instead, that left companies free to move. So the traditional triangle of steel production changed dramatically. And that was what allowed steel production, for example, it's a really good example, to move abroad. So yes, well done. So again, a really interesting theory to think about, and these principles still apply very much today. And if you're good at math, you can actually work it out very easily. Or not very easily, but you can work these things out and you are very employable. Similarly, you're very employable when it comes to tertiary activities. And the classic example here is the location of consumer services like stores, and the sort of famous example is the Starbucks. How do we know where we can locate the next Starbucks? In some places, of course, there's one on every corner, and in other places not. They're very spread out. And we know that Starbucks was a West Coast phenomenon. certain cities, not other cities in Canada. And there's a map that was done of the kind of Tim Hortons cities and the Starbucks cities a while back. That was kind of fun. But there's an entire infrastructure and an entire job sector, if you're interested in this, in how you predict whether or not a company can afford to add another location. So I was particularly interested in this when it came to IKEA, because I wanted to know if it would be possible to have an IKEA on the island, because I was hoping there would be at one point, because I needed a lot of stuff. And my understanding is that there had been an IKEA on the island, so probably some of you know this. But when you're thinking about whether or not you can locate another Starbucks or another Tim Hortons or another IKEA, I want you to think back a little bit to Kristalla and what determined the size of his hexagons. So what would you measure to see if Starbucks could afford to locate another storefront? How would you decide? If you were IKEA, you would have a much bigger market area that you would need for locating another IKEA, for sure. But the principles are the same. So what would you want to know if you were a Starbucks manager, whether or not you could afford to open another storefront? That's really the question that we're asking here. And the models that are used nowadays, they use GIS modeling. They overlay different indicators, the things I'm trying to get you to think about. And they're pretty sophisticated. So if you're good at this stuff, there's definitely money to be made. Yes, so Dylan's talking about distance to other coffee shops. That's a really good point. Now, how come then that some coffee shops can be closer together than others? So, well done. Jessica's saying population. Population is a big one. Population, yes. What about that population, though? What about the characteristics of the population? So what is demand related to? When it comes to Starbucks versus Tim Hortons, what's going to determine how much demand you have for one or the other, and therefore how many you can have? Okay, so totally, you've got it. So cultural factors, partly. Cultural factors are one thing. Some people are Tim Hortons people and some people are Starbucks people. They have very different market segments. So income is key, because Starbucks tend to locate where you have middle to high income. So you're going to look in your demographic statistics for a particular area, you're going to look for middle and high income populations, whereas Tim Hortons tend to locate where you have lower income, lower middle class and lower working people. So that's one thing. So you need a particular demographic, but you also need a particular amount of income to be able to justify it. And that is certainly true for IKEA. So yes, so well done. Those are exactly the things that you're going to determine. And you can predict these things pretty well. But of course, what's interesting to me as a human geographer is that sometimes you can't. That is, people are still people, and they can be unpredictable. And I don't know if you remember that Walmart had to pull out a lot in Canada a couple of years ago. Well, the reason for that was that in spite of all the really careful modeling they had done, they didn't account for Canadian cultural practices, if you like, or habits. And also some kind of intangible nationality that grew around, or nationalism that grew around the fact that Walmart was seen as a large US conglomerate. In reality, many of the other companies that are considered Canadian are in fact also owned by US companies, but it was an identity thing when they interviewed people. It was really, really interesting. So if you're an economist and you're into these things, that would be my argument as to why you need the human geography component, because even though you can assume, economists will often assume that people behave as kind of rational individuals and they model using economic principles, you still have the irrationality of humanity, which means that we still do things you can't predict. All right, so just to finish up here, today, this has been a really important lecture because talking about these economic principles and understanding economic geography is really super important. Just a couple of slides here on how transportation and technology impact the world. We talked about steel and we talked about the global division of labor, which means that even where you can keep, what tends to happen now is that not all your labor is in the same place. So what happens is that your highly skilled, educated labor will tend to stay in the headquarters of the global cities in the core countries of the world, such as the headquarters in Toronto or the headquarters in London or New York, whereas the people who are doing the production side of things, or for example, the call center service elements, are divided and moved to the periphery. So they're separated from labor in the core. So that's a really important point. So that's then, as a result of Wallerstein's model, then we can see that we have a global division of labor. Deindustrialization occurs then when that industry moves out and you lose jobs as a result because labor is cheaper elsewhere and we can afford to transport our finished products. In addition, because of technology, we now don't need to stockpile supplies to make whatever it is we are making. So we have just-in-time services and just-in-time production where we only need to bring things together at the moment that they are ordered by somebody. And what that means is that producers have less loyalty to a particular place, because if it becomes cheaper, the labor becomes cheaper in a different place, and we'll get to that next class, then we can simply move our production quite easily somewhere else because we haven't stored our raw materials there, and therefore our raw materials are somewhere else. We can just simply bring them in very easily. And so that allows international production and international companies to divide their labor into different locations and also to move their production very quickly to wherever it's easiest to do it. We've talked about the sophisticated technology expertise that remains in the core, such as Silicon Valley in California, even though the production of, say, watches or cars or whatever it is might be somewhere else that's driven by that technology. And so the production itself is outsourced. And through history, things have been outsourced. Initially, they were outsourced to Japan. And then, of course, wage rates went up in Japan, and it moved into the core, and so that no longer became viable. And so things moved to Taiwan, and then the same, and Singapore, and the same happened there. And so then they moved labor, they've moved to labor in China. And one of the questions I would ask you is, where do you think they will go next? There is one frontier, if you like, where I would predict that things will go next. Not cheap labor, cheap labor. So if you're an investing person and you're interested in economics and you're interested in investing, you can think about where you would invest next in the world, where the last frontier of cheap labor is. And in fact, if you look at investment patterns, you can see that the Chinese are already investing there in this part of the world. So maybe you can think about that. So regardless of where the production is, or where the primary production or the manufacturing is, you will find that increasingly the consumption is dealt with, or consumption occurs in places of high mass consumption, which takes us back to Wallerstein's core. Yes, some areas of South America, that was certainly one place for sure, Victoria. And then, yeah, Africa to me is the last frontier of cheap labor, because wage labor rates are going up in China right now. And if you look at where the Chinese themselves are investing, they're investing heavily in Africa. So that's interesting. And if you're an investing person, you might think about that. All right, so I'm going to stop there, because it just means a logical place to stop. And we've come to the end of our time, or at least I've come to the end of mine, and you'll get to the end of it very shortly. Next time I'm going to talk about globalization and start to bring the course together. And you'll see that there are two activities that I've asked you to do for the lab, which is basically for the course, for the class this next week. And one is to look at a video called about fashion and whether or not it's fair, it's called. And the other thing to do, believe it or not, is to go into your closet and do a little survey of where the clothes come from that you wear on a regular basis, maybe your favorite clothes. So I'm going to leave you to do that over the weekend, and I'll send out those instructions. And then next week, we will bring everything together by talking about globalization. And also, we will, of course, review for the exam, and I'll help you with that. But Lab 11 is designed to essentially prepare you for the exam and really help you with that. If you do the activities in Lab 11, you'll be really on a good path towards being ready for the final. And hopefully it's a more fun way of studying for the final instead of just having to sit down and look at your books. Okay, so I hope you have a great weekend. I hope you're safe and warm and healthy. And I still miss you, but I love it when you email me. So thank you for emailing me. And thank you, Chloe, for emailing me your lovely email. I will write back soon. And anybody else who has an outstanding question, Ryan, I know you're writing an essay. I'll get back to you on that. And I will look forward to seeing you on Monday. Okay, so take care, everybody. You've been incredible. Tiana says, will there be a review session before the final? There certainly will. That will be the last class, so that's next Thursday. There will be a review session. And if you have questions ahead of time that you'd really like me to answer, I encourage you very much to email those to me, okay? So that I can be absolutely sure to answer them, all right? So Have a great weekend and stay safe, and thank you for coming, and I will see you soon. And I do leave this on a bit because just so it can catch up with all of you and that you get the end. All right, take care then. Miss you. Bye.